But the battery's dead. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from DJ Shadow, Our Pathetic Age. Alright then, I hopefully shouldn't have to introduce Josh Davis to you people. We all know him for introducing, widely considered to be one of, if not the best instrumental hip-hop album of all time, and one of my personal all-time favorite albums. However, that particular album is not really relevant to the discussion on this new album, because Shadow hasn't done anything like it since the 90s, and he's done all he can to not let that album define who he is and what he's about. Going on to put out albums like The Outsider in 2006, which had way more of a focus on mainstream hip-hop from that time, and the hyphy movement specifically, alongside plenty of other interesting sidetracks and collaborations. The Less You Know the Better in 2011, which was, while primarily sample-driven, was a parade through lots of different genres, and still sounded almost nothing like Introducing. And The Mountain Will Fall in 2016, which recontextualized the trap sounds of the time into some weird experimental pieces alongside some great hip-hop tracks like Nobody Speak and The Sideshow. And all of these albums still hold up great to me now. The Outsider and The Mountain Will Fall, in particular, really helping to expand my taste in music, both inside and outside of the electronic music sphere. None of them were love on first listen, though. All three of these albums initially really put me off and took many repeat listens to grow on me. So, in that way, I will understand if some people think Shadow hasn't done anything worthwhile for them since the 90s, but I'm going to continue to disagree. I like how he keeps pushing himself into new territory and trying new things. He is the kind of artist who only does what he wants to do and doesn't really care about what other people think of it, and I've always really admired that about him. Anyways, let's get into Our Pathetic Age, this new double album. I will admit the album cover and title was a little worrying to me. Seems this is the album where Shadow was gonna get political. Oh, but the way that he wanted to center the conversation and social commentary around social media was, people complaining about what if phone bad is so tired and done to death. Especially coming out of older artists like him. But to be fair, that same social commentary was what inspired The Less You Know the Better. And despite the cringy album cover where a smartphone is trying to erase a message on a billboard, subtlety. You could ignore that on the album itself, it didn't really play into the music. This time though, there's an absolute ton of guest rappers, and many of them of the older variety. So the potential of this being a very okay boomer kind of album was definitely there. And one comment I saw on the Discogs page where some old head guy was telling people that these whack-ass MCs these days need to listen, that didn't seem like a great sign. But it is still Shadow. He hasn't had a major misstep for me with any of his other previous albums. Hopefully I would still enjoy this too. And as it turns out, yeah, I had a lot of fun with this project. Honestly, my main complaint with this album is just that it feels like stuff Shadow's done before. This album is split into two discs, the instrumental half where Shadow does his own synth and sample experimentations, and the vocal half which has the avalanche of guest appearances. And yeah, disc 1 reminds me of The Mountain Will Fall, and disc 2 reminds me of The Outsider. This album wasn't a particularly hard turn for Shadow that showed him doing something he's never done before. This is just where his comfort zone kind of is now. But that's probably my biggest complaint. I don't think this album is all that out of touch or cringy either in terms of its social commentary, save for maybe one really quick moment or two. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Point is, this album was a really fun listen, and its separation into the two halves made this 23-track behemoth a lot easier to swallow. 26 if you include the 3 bonus tracks at the end. Yeah, this is basically 2 entirely different albums, though. I'll start with talking about the instrumental album. I personally preferred this disc over the second one. I've heard people say it was boring. I don't really get that. I can maybe see some of these tracks being annoying to some people. But again, there's nothing on here that The Mountain Will Fall hadn't really primed me for. I think this disc shows an even more colorful, more interesting, and less trendy take on similar kinds of sounds to the instrumentals from that album. There's no 3 Ralphs on here, nothing so skeletal or textureless. and there's no moments like Nobody Speak that tonally clash with everything around it. It remains pretty cohesive throughout and feels really cool and forward-thinking. If it reminds me of anything, maybe a tiny bit of something like, I don't know, Hi, This Is Flume. But I still had more fun with this than anything on that thing. May as well get into individual tracks. After a pretty cool intro of distorted clipping, cloudy noises, and nature always wins, that's some good ominous tone building there. We get a fun little dark trap instrumental with Slingblade, some rough sounding synth melodies and dark bassy pads. All sounds pretty cool, helps set up that kind of dystopian sounding feel he's going for. This is admittedly probably the single trendiest sounding track on the whole album, but the melodies and progressions it goes through make it still fun to listen to. There's some fun stabby bass lines and epic build-ups on intersectionality, some cool jazzy percussion tracks and pianos going up against more acidy textures on beauty, power, motion, life, work, chaos, law. That is a mouthful. A track as strange and compelling as this one makes me wonder how some people found this boring. It sounds pretty awesome to me. There's some really intense sample chopping and noisy blasts throughout Juggernaut, which, okay, I would get this track being a bit much for some people. This is probably the closest we get to something like Three Ralphs. I mean, there's absolutely no melody anywhere, but it's so much more abrasive, has more personality, it has more substance and a wonkier structure. It was a ton of fun, personally, and came off pretty badass, all things considered. And I usually don't even care for these kinds of sounds. Anyways, there's the awesome orchestral and soundtrack-y tones of Firestorm. That track was super epic and dramatic and atmospheric, a major highlight every time. Probably my favorite track on this side of the album. Also like the kind of weird, off-kilter, drunk-sounding atmospherics of Weightless. Interesting stuff, if not always a huge standout. I wasn't sure if I liked Rosie on first listen, since that first sample right at the beginning was really upbeat and cheery. It was a pretty big whiplash from the dark and dystopian tones of the previous tracks, like I see the Rosie in my midnight dreams. But this one really grew on me too. I like how it continually shifts and evolves through its multiple sections, and chops up that initial sample and has fun with it, and then halfway through breaks into this gorgeous melodic section that forgave any misgivings with the track I had previously. Not to say every track on this side hit the mark. Like, the next track, If I Die Today, is probably the lowest point. While it has this excellent jazzy instrumental underneath everything, it also brings in these vocal samples that are pitched an octave up and an octave down, respectively, and it sounds pretty bad. Yeah, that pitched up sample in particular is pitched way too far up and sounds like Alvin and the Chipmunks. That gets grating. This one had potential, just didn't quite get there for me. But yeah, the rest is good. My Lonely Room, that was interesting with its mix of abrasive but still melodic and melancholic synths and typewriter noises. Even flutes at the end. Fits well into that technological dystopian feel again, although this particular one disappears from my head pretty quickly. Thankfully, it ends strongly with We Are Always Alone, a more emotional, piano-driven track that does deliver that sense of isolation very well. Reminds me of Ashes to Oceans in the way it so well captures that mood, but it's much more subtle and empty sounding in the best way. So, yeah, I liked pretty much everything on this first disc. Not perfect by any stretch, but it feels like even more of a progression of some of the things I liked about The Mountain Will Fall, and captures its dystopian mood really well. There is a part of me who wonders how much I'd be into it if I didn't have the second half there as a contrast, and it obviously isn't going to be as big a watershed taste-expanding moment for me like The Mountain Will Fall was. But nah, I think disc 1 is pretty great. Anyways, now we gotta get into disc 2, which is a completely different beast. I was a little more worried about this disc going into it, and yeah, it is a little spotty and inconsistent. There are some tracks here that I wasn't really feeling for various different reasons, and it doesn't come together as a whole nearly as well as the first half. He does try to have more of like an overarching feel, with most of these tracks being about modern society in some way, and there is a very downbeat mood to a lot of this, but not all of it. It's a bit of a mishmash, and it just kind of feels like a collection of tracks, but I do like most of the tracks on here all the same. I may as well get the tracks I didn't like out of the way. I did not like Rain on Snow, and not because of any element individually. It's like a mini Wu-Tang reunion with pretty fun verses from Inspector Deck, Ghostface Killah, and Raekwon, but it has this super delicate and smooth sample as its hook, just this woman singing from like this 40s movie soundtrack or something, and it feels ridiculously out of place next to their hard-hitting performances and the noisy beats he switches to underneath them. DJ Shadow, what's good? That hook is so badly placed, it's almost laughable. That was so distracting I couldn't pay attention to anything else going on in this track. Maybe that sample could have worked in like a 6 days kind of track, and the guest verses do try to relate back to the title, but sonically it just made no freaking sense here. This track did not work, and that is entirely Shadow's fault. I also didn't care for Small College's Stay With Me, but mainly because absolutely nothing stuck out about that one. Not a single memorable line or memorable hook. It is basically pure filler. I guess Wiki's voice is kind of weird and distinct sounding, but you probably could have cut this one. The other one I was iffy on is Urgent Important Please Read, which was the one track on here that fulfilled some of my fears about feeling kind of out of touch with the social media complaining stuff. And for what it's worth, it's not even that bad. Shadow's instrumental is really good, it hits hard, it leads in out of this one interlude pretty well. And there are good lines here and there through all the description of our titular pathetic age. I like how at the very end they admit that they don't really have a solution for any of the problems they describe. For instance, there's also a Ghost in the Shell reference too, I guess that's cool. But there are just two crappy lines on this track that just stuck out like a sore thumb. I don't know who said what, but there's one of the guys says, "The machines are gonna win, I'm gonna be the first to say it." No, you're not the first to say it. Shut up, dude. A million people said this. The other one came like right after some cool anti-capitalism lines, like the one guy says, "The rich gets richer and we get whatever the rich gets sick of," but then it's followed up by, "You eat some shit for dinner and your bitch gets thicker." Yeah, you derailed that one. This track just kinda stinks of being fake deep. Not gonna lie. There's a lot of lines about shooting people and all that usual rap stuff you expect. But I think that's about as far as low points go, though. Like, that's the worst of it. There are tracks that I don't love, but I think are cool. Like this disc's opener, Drone Warfare, with Nas and Pharaoh Monch. That was a solid opener to the disc. It felt like it transitioned out of disc 1 pretty smoothly with its first couple of seconds. The two guys have little mentions of climate change, government surveillance, obviously drone strikes as you might guess from the title. And Nas has one line, "Technology changed the game, I'm an investor." Which I took a line as to say, hey, technology and social media can be used for positive ends too. That's a nice one. The track that most openly talks about social media, C.O.N.F.O.R.M, C.O.N.F.O.R.M, or whatever. I was kind of expecting this to also be on the pretentious fake deep side, but they do really go in depth and don't blame social media itself for these problems, but rather big corporations using it to their own ends. There's a good line about how if a cop kills you, you just become a trending topic. They actually go about this topic in a smart way. One of the guys fully admits to being part of the problem with his own addiction to social media. It's not even that pretentious, and Shadow's beat is catchy and solid and fits the tone of the track well. Actually pretty good, well done. And I don't really have many complaints about any of the other tracks either. Like Rocket Fuel with De La Soul. That might be a little out of place given how upbeat and happy it is. But damn is it catchy and puts me in a good mood so easily. It's such a fun little track and provides a much needed bright spot among all the darkness of the rest of the album. I liked this track when it dropped way before the album, but I absolutely love it now. It's this album's equivalent to Nobody Speak, one of my absolute favorites. Fantastic. And the actual track with Run the Jewels, this one is Kings and Queens. That sounds nothing like Nobody Speak, but it's also one of the biggest highlights. Mainly because of Shadow's soul-sampling instrumental. That track was great all the way through. And Taxin, that's a really short track under 2 minutes, but it leaves an impression. Got an excellent verse from Dave East. his cool storytelling, and Shadow's instrumental is butter smooth and quiet and melancholy. That's great too. There's 2 tracks here that delve directly into talking about suicide. You got Jojo's Words with Stro, which is by far the darkest moment on the album, with a really graphically detailed and harrowing depiction of a story in which Stro kills himself by slitting his wrists. I mean, it's fictional, but massive yikes. And the instrumental is really dark and menacing to match it. This is the kind of track that might give some people nightmares, if not, like, outright trigger others. Fair warning. But I have to mark it as a favorite for how powerful and gut-wrenching it is. And Dark Side of the Heart goes into similar topics, if not nearly as graphic, and with a smoother and much more comforting instrumental with his catchy chorus, "Time keeps moving on." I really like that one too. Finally, the album ends with the title track. Doesn't have any rapping on it, but rather it's like a singer-songwriter piano song with like a disco beat underneath. And it's sung by Samuel T. Herring. Kinda feels like the more depressing companion to something like This Time I'm Gonna Try It My Way. It was a really solid closer. Oh yeah, and there's 3 bonus tracks too, and surprisingly they're all good. There's a track with Pusha T called Been Used To, that was fun. There's a longer version of Taxin, which features an extra verse from Loyal Carner, that's cool. And there's the track 2 Notes with Barney Fletcher, which would not be a very good closer. Bit too upbeat to work like that, but that has a lot of personality and flavor. I wouldn't have minded this being in the main bulk of the album somewhere as another brighter spot. So yeah, that's it. We finally made it through all the tracks on Our Pathetic Age. Obviously, this album is a lot. I would not at all blame people if they said this was too much Shadow for them. But this kept me invested pretty much the whole time, and I wasn't burnt out on Shadow at the end either. Maybe if you had the bonus tracks, that'd be a bit much for me, but most of my listens, I treated the title track as the actual ending. Pretty sure that's how he intended it too. And at the end, I would always have no problem just plopping the whole thing back on from the very beginning. No small feat considering this thing's length. I don't know if Our Pathetic Age is one of my favorite Shadow albums overall. It's not perfect or totally bulletproof. There are a couple of weak tracks on here. In general, I seriously doubt this album's gonna be for everyone. If you find it corny and way too overstuffed, I get you, but I had a lot of fun with this. First listen, I thought it was good, and it's only gotten better and turned up even more favorites with every successive listen I've given it. Once again, the only big issue with the album is that it all felt like familiar territory for Shadow. It's all stuff he's proven himself capable of doing in the past, and didn't really reveal anything new to me about him that I didn't know already. But yeah, this album was a lot of fun. Easily diverse enough to justify its sprawling length and never feel tedious. And I personally did not find it to be cringy OK Boomer bait as the packaging might have you believe. Definitely worth giving a shot. Shadow's done it again. I think as a whole, both discs together, this just barely gets away with a solid 8. I really enjoyed this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.